Good evening. Hi, my name is Jay Kettering. I'm the on-campus events coordinator at the Alumni Association. And on behalf of the Alumni Association, I want to thank you for coming to the final night of the 2011 Community Lecture Series. Hope you've been enjoying it. It's been a great year, and we're looking forward to another one next year. I'd like to do a quick thank you to the committee that puts these series together. And this year's committee included Ann Boone, Susan Cuff, Jerry Fetz, Linda Gillison, Don Hobby, Kitty Robbins, David Shad, and Ashleen Williams. And let's give them a round of applause. Also, just have a couple other quick thank yous. Holly Truitt at Spectrum. She's the one who put the coupon on the back of the program so that people attending the series could also go see the brain exhibit at the Spectrum over in the Skaggs building. And tonight, we do have the MCAT schedules. We'll have them. They're on the table outside. And tonight, there will be a wine and cheese reception immediately following the lecture and panel discussion. And it's going to, if you come out of the theater, hang a left, go through the double doors, and just work your way around, you'll see it's in the 330 series rooms. And we'll have some treats there, and you can meet and talk to the professors. And there's Molly materials for the Osher Lifelong Learning Center, and they'll be out on the table, and we'll also have those in the reception area. And the other thing I'd like to ask you to do tonight, if you have time, we have a questionnaire that just gives us a little feedback. You can let us know the things that you liked about the series, what you'd like to see next year, and we always like to get a hold of those, and it really helps us put together these series for the coming years. And we will have the series on iTunes University this year, and that's going to be coming. Look for that on our website, and I should have that link hopefully in the next week or two. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor of Biology and Neuroscience and Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Chris Comer.
Thank you, Jay. Jay's been instrumental in making sure that everything happened and keeping the whole group of speakers together, so I want to thank him especially. And I want to thank the audience because you've turned out each week and asked lots of good questions. We're going to challenge you tonight to keep doing that and ask lots of good questions. What I'm going to do tonight is to try to be relatively brief, speak for 15 or 20 minutes to just highlight a few features of neuroscience research, mostly recent, that I think is relevant to education, and try to poke some questions that I think are important. And then the speakers from the series will join me at the table here, and we've invited some special guests from the field of education who know more about it than some of us and can talk about the issues not just at the university level, but spanning the whole system from K through 12 and the university. So what I want to start off with is a brief review of where we've been. And I made these up myself, so I hope I didn't do injustice to any of my colleagues' presentations. But we started out with evolution, and the point there was to just point out that in biology, sometimes small changes make big differences. And that's true where one or two genes changing in the course of evolution may have given rise to something like our capacity for language, very dramatic changes. In education, I think the same is true. I'll show you some evidence tonight that very small changes in the brain might have very large impacts on a child's learning ability. And I think that's pretty significant stuff. Rich talked about molecules and went to the level of the synapse and really showed us that's a hot spot in several senses of the word. It's a hot spot for processes of learning, and it's a really important site for intervention because so much happens at a synapse. It's a computational entity in the nervous system. Most of the drugs that have powerful impacts on learning and memory are going to work at synapses, and that will become relevant in some of our discussion as we go along. Sarah introduced us to genes and how they impact the nervous system and the concept of sexual dimorphism, how male and female behaviors are sometimes different and have different strategies. Certainly, that leads to the control of complex behaviors, and that's an important message here, that neuroscience explains everything from simple reflexes up to dreaming, wish fulfillment, thinking about the future, attaining educational goals, all the really macro things that we care about. John talked about happiness, and this is a really important point because he talked about the fact that to understand the production of happiness and how it's maintained, there are neural factors, but there's also behavioral factors. When you think about it, the brain is the organ of behavior. So of course it's extremely receptive to behavioral inputs, as well as things like pharmacological inputs. And then Ashby talked about art and literature, and there's an important point there that, you know, even nuanced behaviors, think of things that we think of as being very sublime and subtle, nonetheless can be influenced by neural factors. And as you'll see later on, I'll mention the fact that the arts and the humanities are actually, I think, a key ingredient in thinking about how neuroscience can impact education. So we'll come back to that. This is what I want to cover tonight. This is my main point. And if you remember this, I'd be really happy. Education is applied brain science. I feel this very deeply. I think some of the others on this group of speakers feel it very passionately as well. Every time a teacher walks into a classroom, they are impacting the brains of young children. And in fact, they're physically changing them when they do their work. And understanding how that happens, what makes it happen effectively, how we make that happen powerfully is really an important question. So the first thing I want to do is just ask how many folks in the room either currently teach or have taught at the K through 12 level? Wow, I suspected. A large audience of educators. That's fantastic. And I'm sure you'll have strong opinions about some of the issues we raise, and we're going to want to hear those as we go along. So let's get right to it. I want to summarize briefly what we know about how brains are sort of situated to deal with education. And that means that we have to ask questions about the young brain of humans and how it changes over time. So here's two classic findings that I think are kind of fun to look at, and they establish a background. On the left is a table from a book by Eric Lenneberg, which is a classic on the biological foundations of language. And it shows that across age, which is shown along the horizontal axis here, there are differing brain weights you can see. So obviously, newborn babies has a fairly small brain. It grows in a pretty systematic fashion if you sample the whole of a human population. And you can see that during the period of language acquisition here, from approximately 2 to 10 years, although that's somewhat variable, brain weight's changing quite a bit. So that means the physical substrate of the brain is changing in somewhat dramatic ways during that time. And for a long time, that's about all we knew about the dynamic changes in the brain during early phases of learning. This kind of information here was added in the 70s, late 70s, the 80s, and into the 90s. And this is interesting work from Peter Huntlocker's lab. What Peter did was to, now he's a clinical neurologist, but he's also doing basic science research. He took the brains of a large number of individuals who had died at various ages and went back and developed a stain where he could see the synapses, those structures that Rich was talking about, selectively. They would just stains and jump out of you at the tissue, and they could go through and count them in the brain. And what this shows is, on this axis here, it's the density of the synapses in the tissue as a function of age. And this is kind of a famous graph in neuroscience these days. What it shows in the blue line right here is the profile of the density of synapses over time from birth. Right here is the newborn brain up to adult, and we've kind of truncated the adult because we go through adolescence here, and then things stay pretty straight, so they didn't bother to push the line all the way out there. What it shows you is that the number of synapses is a very dynamic number. It goes up very dramatically, as you'd expect, as the brain grows, but then, oddly, it starts to drop, and it drops continuously into adolescence and slightly beyond. This was something that wasn't appreciated up until the point when this data was derived. And it's a very common phenomenon, it turns out, that we didn't know about, which is that synapses are overproduced. It's called exuberance. And then they're pruned back as you hone and refine neural processing. So it means that if you just think the brain is just adding things to itself, no, it's actually adding and subtracting. And these numbers of synapses is probably a dynamic balance between the new ones being added and the old ones that are going away. So there's really a tremendous amount of dynamic change going on there. Second thing that's in here that's kind of interesting is this red line. So this is visual cortex. So that's the back of the brain, gets input from the eyes. And that's the density of synapses there, and you can see how it's changing. If you look at the prefrontal cortex up here, what you see is this different relationship where the numbers of synapses grows more slowly and it peaks closer to adolescence. And then it starts to decline more gradually. And what's not shown here is it continues to change out towards adulthood. That data is truncated, so you can't really see the dynamics there. That's really important because it turns out that because the different parts of the brain are maturing at different ages, the brains as a full structural entity and a full functional entity of young children and teens are physically different from the brains of adults. Now that's true in lots of dimensions, but here's one really important one. The front parts of the brain are developing more slowly. They mature later. And if you ask most psychologists about what are the characteristics of young kids and teens, their self-control, ability to take in modulatory inputs and balance those correctly are vastly different from adults. And a lot of that circuitry where you calculate the valence of different things, you calculate whether or not you want to take a risk, you calculate whether or not you want to respond to peer pressure, are probably being done up the frontal cortex. And it's not even fully connected to the rest of the brain until adolescence. So when teachers are in the classroom and they're dealing with children, they are not dealing with a small version of an adult brain. They're dealing with a very different kind of brain. Okay. Now, another point that's really important is plasticity. This is a really general term. It's used throughout neuroscience. Sometimes it's misused a little bit because plasticity just means ability to change in sort of an adaptive way. So if you want to think about it, learning is plasticity. And there's many forms of plasticity. So I want to show you one classic one. John Summers Flanagan and I both were aware of this data and talked about putting it in our earlier talks, and we didn't, so I thought I'd throw it up here tonight. This is a picture of a, whoops, let me go back here. Picture of a monkey's brain, and this is a classic experiment that was done in the 80s, and as I described to one audience recently, when I read this paper the first time, my jaw dropped because the results were so astounding, and I ran down the hall and I got my graduate students and said, you have to read this paper, it's amazing. So here's the background. Here's the cortex. You're looking at the right side of the brain, and there's a strip of cortex here where there's a map of the body surface. And I showed you some stuff on that in the very first lecture, the homunculus, which represents the sensory input from the whole body surface. And in primates, where hands are so important, there's a very large piece of that that represents our hands, and it's sitting right here. Now if we blow that up, this is what it looks like. And there's a major region here that represents the 5th digit, 4th, 3rd, 2nd, and 1st. So each digit has its own territory of representation. Now this is a cartoon. It's actually exceedingly more complex than that. There are actually about 7 different maps. They have different submodalities of representation, but that's a good and a fair characterization of it in a general way. So there's the digits out there. That's how they're represented in the brain. Now, it had been known for some time that if you're missing a digit or if something changes physically about the hand, the map in the brain will adapt to that. I'll show you an example of it here. If you look up here, loss of a finger, and here's the map. I don't know if you can see that quite as clearly, but there's 1, 2, 4, and 5. So the territory of the third digit's not there anymore. So the territory of the brain that had been monitoring the third digit is now occupied by cells who have switched their connections, and they're monitoring the 2nd or the 4th digit. So they've completely changed their connections. Now, that's probably not too surprising. Things like peripheral nerve damage, dramatic insult to the nervous system, neurologists have known for a long time that's sometimes compensated. But here's what really shocked everyone. In this other experiment, this was done in Michael Merznick's lab at San Francisco, what they did was they had monkeys trained to get juice rewards by reaching out of the cage, and with just 2 fingers, they could just barely touch this manipulandum here. If they touched it in the right way and sampled the texture, they would get a juice reward. They became exceedingly expert at reaching through the cage and touching that textured surface to get the juice reward. The animals were mapped before the experiment and then at the end of the experiment. And lo and behold, what you see is shown right here. The territory of those 2 fingers that were used in a behaviorally meaningful way expanded in the cortex. That means that lots of cells up here that would have been monitoring the 1st digit are now picking up information from the 2nd because it's behaviorally significant. And cells over here that might have been monitoring the 4th digit have now switched, and they're paying attention to the 3rd digit because it's become so significant. And up until this point, I think it hadn't been appreciated how subtle behavioral changes in an animal's daily routine is going to be reflected in physical change in the structure of the brain. I consider this highly significant. There's been lots and lots of follow-up studies. So other labs have repeated this. They've seen the same thing. And it's a really powerful effect. And by the way, it's not specific to the sense of touch. It's been seen in the visual system. It's been seen in the auditory system as well. And the auditory system, Merznick's lab has actually been looking at young children that have auditory processing deficits, and that's connected to speech and reading deficits. And using their knowledge of the rules by which these changes occur, they've developed tests that they can give to young children. They're actually computer games that help them to overcome their auditory processing deficit and then show that they actually improve in both reading and language production. So this kind of research actually can lead to very practical changes of an educational sort. Okay, so major point about plasticity. Connections between brain cells change all the time. Probably they're changing every day in each one of our brains. It used to be thought that the connections changed only in young brains. Not true at all. Those experiments were done in adult monkeys, and it's very clear that connections change even in the adult brain. So we know that stimulation is good for changing those connections, so the fact that you're here tonight listening to this lecture, I hope, is causing lots of connections to change in very productive ways. These changes sometimes can be turned on within hours, although often they take a little longer. And they can be enduring for years if the stimulus which gives rise to them is potent enough. And last but not least, I think every biologist that has contemplated this in the last 10 years has pointed out this is one of the biological bases for human individuality. Because your brain is so susceptible to these behavioral inputs, everybody's brain in this room is recognizably a human brain if it was looked at up close. But yet, because you've had each different experiences, the subtle details of the wiring in your brain is idiosyncratically your very own. It's not like anybody else's. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind. And it really means that when you study the brain, there's really no such thing as the brain. There's just lots of different human brains. And that's a very biological perspective on thinking about nature. Biologists use a population mode of thinking. It's actually too platonic to say there's such a thing as the brain. That might exist in Plato's cave, but in the real world, there are just lots of individual brains, each of which are unique. And that's important when you think about kids in a classroom. Okay, real quick, tell you something about memory that I think is fun. I want to read for you, if I can, from this book by Eric Kandel. Just one quote. Eric is a Nobel laureate, and he won it for his work in neuroscience studying molecular bases of changes related to learning at synapses. And he wrote this book, In Search of Memory, and I picked it up not too long ago and started reading it, and it's really well written. Not all scientists can write well, but he does a really fine job. And he spent his whole career trying to search for the physical substrate of memory. And here's something he said about it that I think is really interesting. First, he quotes Tennessee Williams. As Tennessee Williams wrote in The Milk Train Doesn't Stop Here Anymore, describing what we now call explicit memory, quote, "Has it ever struck you that life is all memory except for the one present moment that goes by so quickly you hardly catch it going?" And then he points out, and this is very important, recalling memory episodically, which is what we typically do, no matter how important the memory, it's not simply turning to a photograph in an album. It's nothing like that. Recall of memory is a creative process. What the brain stores is thought to be only a core memory. Upon recall, this core memory is elaborated and it's reconstructed with subtractions, additions, and alterations. That, I think, is really significant, very important to thinking about children and adults in an educational process. We tend to have simplified notions of memory. I know I did when I started out, that it really is like a computer memory where things are very faithfully represented. You just simply look them up and there they are. But the last 15 years have shown us that when you recall a memory, you pull it out of a stable state and pull it into a labile state where it can be affected dramatically. And then you have to restore it again every time you've called it up. That's called reconsolidation. Now, we argue in neuroscience about the details of that process, but there's no question that that process is happening. The implications of that, I'm sure John would be quick to point out, are profound for clinical psychology. If you have people with traumatic memories and you can find a way to safely evoke it and get the memory into labile state and then degrade the ability to restore it, which, by the way, some drugs can do, you might be able to erase harmful memories. Now, the ability to selectively call up memories and erase them raises enormous ethical issues, so maybe we can talk about that as we go on. But here's a fun fact of memory that just points out the amazing explicit nature of it. This is a study that's very famous to neuroscientists. I don't know if you've heard of it before, but a couple of labs in England studied London cabbies very extensively. And the reason they did this is because to become a cabbie in London, you have to pass a very rigorous test, and you have to know where every street is, and you have to know to get from any one point in the map of London to any other point by the shortest route. And they spend 2 years training, and then they have to take a very rigorous test. So their spatial memory is believed to be exquisite, and it's on the basis of a learning experience. So here's what we know about it. When you actually study them working out map problems, it turns out that their right hippocampus lights up. Now that wasn't surprising to anybody because the hippocampus is known to be important for memory. It's profoundly lit up on the right side, so those cells are very, very active and they're processing lots of spatial information. In this case, this was a group of cabbies that were compared to matched controls who were bus drivers. And the reason is actually really important because the fact that they had certain attributes of their brain related to driving a taxi might have been simply due to the stress of the job, being in heavy traffic, having to go along a daily route. But bus drivers don't have to take that test, and they follow the same route every day pretty much. So they don't have that mental map of London in their head. And so compared to them, this is what they found. Oops, go back here. The size of the posterior hippocampus actually increased in these compared to normal controls. And indeed, this was the really powerful part. As a function of years of experience taxi driving, the size of the posterior hippocampus increased. Now that means more cells and perhaps more dense interconnections between them. And it turns out that we used to think no new cells are born in the brain, but they are, and they're born in the hippocampus. And so almost certainly this is the addition of new cells into functional circuits. Interesting thing about this is while the posterior hippocampus increases in volume, there's a trade-off here. The anterior hippocampus decreases, and that's involved in somewhat related but slightly different processes. So there's a trade-off here. To increase the skill in one area, you might lose something in another. And that's really important in education. If you're going to try to pinpoint a certain part of information processing or memory in a student, you have to be thinking about what you're doing to other attributes the student may be working with at the same time. Okay, this was pretty dramatic as well when it was first seen because think of this, a dramatic physical change. The actual size of this brain structure is changing as a function of your profession. It's just an example of how behavioral inputs can really change the brain physically. Okay, last point about memory is just that in the last couple of years there's been a series of papers by, let me go back here, these two individuals here, Schachter and Addis, who've been studying memory and looking at memory for past events in relation to how you imagine the future. And their research is stunning, absolutely stunning. What they've shown is that this set of circuitry up here, these areas in the brain that are in red, the details don't matter too much. A bunch of them in the temporal lobe, which is not too surprising. We've already known that's involved in memory. There's a little bit here in the parietal temporal junction, and there's a little bit up here in the retrosplenial cortex. Those details don't matter. The point is that there are circumscribed areas that are well known to be related to memory. Now what they found is that if patients are deficient in remembering the past, oddly enough, we hadn't asked this question until quite recently, they're also deficient in imagining the future. So if you ask them to engage in an imaginary event where they imagine something spatially or some personal experience into the future, they have a real paucity of an ability to make that imaginary leap. And nobody had appreciated this until about 10 years ago, and we discovered that people with certain kinds of amnesia, when they were tested for future imaginative possibilities, they're very, very limited. So the two things seem to be related. They've gone on now to show that this set of circuitry in the brain is uniquely activated not only when you think about the past, but when you imagine the future. Now, there's a lot of nuances to this. It depends on exactly what form of memory, and there's a very elaborate taxonomy of memory for physiologists. There's lots of different kinds of it. But this is a pretty dramatic finding, and I think it raises a question for education. Memory as a tool, certainly in my lifetime, was always put down as something that, increasing your memory capacity is mindless. It's not interesting. It has no positive impact. I'm not sure, but we're just at the beginning of this set of studies. It may raise the question that certain forms of memory training might actually enhance creativity and the ability to think imaginatively about the future. And this actually totally relates to what I just told you about memory from Eric's book, When you recall memory, you pull it up into labile state, and it's very flexible, and you can add and subtract. If you think of memory as being high fidelity, it's got to be perfect. Why would it be that way? And the theory is, for evolutionary reasons, our memory circuitry is how we think about and plan for the future. So we have to creatively combine possibilities to do that. So since you use the same circuits for memory as for imagining the future, it stands to reason that those circuits are a little bit futzy and don't reproduce things with high fidelity because they creatively combine experiences. And there's a deep psychological literature on individuals recalling events and then getting things conflated because they've put multiple events together. In fact, we've probably all done that in our lives. So memory is a very interesting thing, and it's a very constructive process, and it may be directly connected as the obverse to imagination. Last but not least, I just wanted to mention that there's new tools available now for studying learning in a clinical sort of setting. This is a study from last year that was, actually 2 years ago, that was pretty striking. They trained students on a new method for teaching reading, and they used a completely new brain imaging technique. This isn't what you've seen before. This is a new technique called diffusion tensor imaging, and it actually looks at some subtle chemical features of myelin, and it shows you tracks or connections in the brain that have thickened and changed as a function of usage. And what this shows is that in a group of kids who had a deficit, let me go back here, this blue area here shows a deficit. This is the normal brain. They have, on the left side, which is more connected to language, they have a slight, what you might call a weak connection between the front of the brain and the back part of the brain. When they receive the training, there's an improvement in this, and they can actually approach a situation where they look like a normal brain. There's a balance between the two sides. So this is kind of dramatic because this is a non-invasive technique. The pupils, and by the way, these were grammar school children, were given the training, imaged before and after, and you can actually see the physical change in the brain. So this raises the question as to whether or not these techniques are going to now be available to educators to answer questions. Instead of saying, I think my approach to teaching math works better than your approach, maybe they could actually get some objective evidence about whether or not the brain has changed in an adaptive way. Okay, so here's the concepts I'm going to finish up on. The brains of children and teens are dramatically different, physically different. That's very important to education, I think. Neuroplasticity is ubiquitous. All brains seem to be capable of adaptation, even our brains that are older. And that's really heartening to me anyway. And one of the people who has worked in this field so much wrote a powerful article on this. He called it the neurology of hope. Memory has limits, we know that, but it also has possibilities. And it may be that we've not explored creative ways to reintegrate using memory approaches in education. And then new tools can really track learning in real time. And the question is, how are we going to use those? And to me, it raises ethical issues. For example, those techniques are really powerful, but they're really expensive. So if they became available, will those go to school districts in only richer districts, or will it be available to all children that need it? That happens often with medical technology. One has to worry about how do you distribute it fairly in the population. That's an immediate question that would be raised, not to mention the fact that you have to evaluate the safety of this, not just for people in general, but specifically for young developing minds, and make sure it's not going to have any deleterious effects. Okay, so what can we do? And I'm going to finish up on this and then invite the rest of the speakers up to answer questions. Can we effectively connect research with practice? I'll show you in a minute that I think we can, and I think we want to raise some issues about how we do that. If we study research in the College of Education and in the College of Arts and Sciences and the College of Pharmacy and such, and we're learning things about it, how do we connect that up to teachers out in the field who are working with students every day? There's a lot of important things here, like the fact that you have trade-offs. If you train for something, you might enhance that ability, but you might take something else away. Maybe we need to know which circuits that's happening and what the nature of the trade-off is so that it can be used effectively in an educational paradigm. Something that's really important here, and I didn't have time to go into it, and I chucked it just for time's sake, there's profound evidence that training in the arts enhances learning in other areas. And the best evidence is in music. Kids who have taken musical lessons, if you monitor their ability to do mathematical problems and language processing, it's by far and away superior on average to kids who are not. And that's been seen again and again, lots of different ways to measure it. And there's no question that training in the arts, and I suspect in the humanities as well, has powerful influences on other kinds of basic brain processing. And that, we know it, but we don't know how to use it yet. and we don't systematically use it in a policy sense. And I think there's some real important policy questions for education that we might address in that area. How do we train teachers to keep them current? You know, in medicine and in nursing, we have powerful models for getting practitioners well trained and out in the community. We have teaching hospitals. Do we have anything like that in education? Well, maybe yes and maybe no. Where do we locate researchers? Where do we locate teachers? Well, we have lots of researchers on the campus and lots of hardworking practicing teachers in the schools in Missoula. They don't interact all that much. And what can we do to get them interacting more frequently? Can we think of novel ways to do that? Instead of having all our laboratories up here on the mountain campus, could we locate a few of those labs downtown in some of the schools so that teachers could leave the classroom and spend an hour or two working on research, so that students could see their teachers working on research, so that students could get involved in the projects? Lots of labs wouldn't be appropriate to locate downtown, but maybe some of ours would. And how do we get teachers up to campus involved in ways that they find meaningful to help them renew their knowledge of educational practice and to really be effective teachers? And that's really related to the last point. How do we clue scientists into teachers' world? We don't want scientists in one place at a research institute or up here on the campus not being aware of the very real-world challenges that teachers face, and there's immense numbers of challenges. They're educational, there's social, there's policy challenges, all sorts of things. What assumptions do we make when we work with the tracking of students? If the students' brains are changing dramatically across the whole lifespan, at what point do you want to track a student and say, this student's never going to make it in science, let's put him in something else? Or make other such decisions? Do school districts take the best emerging information about the changing brain into account when they make policy decisions? And if they don't, why don't they? Do we train educators to know about these facts? If there's a renaissance in understanding the brain, shouldn't our teachers learn the best, most recent information? I think they should. And then ethical issues. There's just so many we face. You know, there's a big issue about something we call cognitive enhancers. We've probably all had some today. Coffee is one of the most common cognitive enhancers. And about, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, lots of pills started to be developed by scientists, many of them friends of ours, who have now spin-off companies, and they're biotech firms that are developing pills that are cognitive enhancers. The first round of these, as I understand it, were probably not much more potent than a cup of coffee. But that's being improved. And as these become available, what does the educator do about this? If you have children in your class and some have access to these medications and some don't, how do you work with that? How does the school district set policy about cognitive enhancement, which is partly here and will be here like gangbusters in the very near future? What does an educational district do about policy for brain imaging? Brain imaging is a very powerful tool. You can practically read minds with brain imaging. Could it ever be used safely with children in an ethical sense? There's tremendous issues there that have to be tackled. Real quickly, here's just one example. This is a recent paper from Science. Teachers' participation in research programs improves their students' achievement in science. Actual measurements showing that teachers in New York, compared to controls that were not participating, if they went and they spent their summers doing research as respected, co-equal researchers in labs with scientists, boom. When they come back, their students benefit from that, and they do better on their math and science. So this is what we need, really concrete evidence about what works and what doesn't work. And how do we get there, and how do we answer these questions of a policy sort? So in order to switch gears, what I'd like to do is call my colleagues up here. Sarah, Ashby, John, Rich. And we've also invited Bobby Evans, who's the Dean of the College of Education and Human Sciences, and Mark Thane, who's an administrator in the MCPS school system. We wanted to make sure we had some voices from folks who are actually out there dealing with policy and dealing with teaching on a day-to-day basis. So what we'd like to do at this point is open up the floor to questions of two sorts. Number one, you may have questions that came from the presentations you've heard over the last 5 weeks. Anything's fair game, anything that tickled your fancy. I got asked a question early on about the difference between men's and women's brains, and I dodged the question for, I think, good reasons. But Sarah is better in a position to answer that, and I certainly am willing to go out on a limb and say I'm quite sure that the brains of young children and teens are quite different from those of adults. That's a pretty safe assumption. So any of those questions are fair game, and we would encourage you to ask questions specifically about education if you are interested. Yes?
You mentioned that there was a...
Oh, let me interrupt you. Tonight, we're really trying to get this on video, so if you ask a question, make sure you got the microphone. Thanks.
You mentioned in the monkey studies about the function of digits and the loss of digits. What about a child that's born with a sixth digit and that digit is taken away? Do you have anything that would show up about that?
I don't know any specific published research on it. I mean, assume that if there's an extra digit, it would be represented in the nervous system, and if it's taken away, then that information would be lost. But because things get filled in, you'd probably end up with a map ultimately a year or two later that would be approximately normal. I mean, that's the beauty of it. The system really does kind of equilibrate with time.
I will not be offended if you laugh at this question.
No.
Okay? This is in relationship to an injured brain. And what you said tonight really reinforced how repetition over time can help to make new neural paths in the brain. What about an idle brain? What happens to an idle brain? This lecture that I had attended, my understanding was for an injured brain that you could end up with something like a tumbleweed in your head and end up with other conditions that would cause you problems if you weren't doing something to retrain and rehabilitate that brain. That's the part that I want you to respond to.
Anybody on the panel want to jump in on that? Those should be on already.
Are these on? It's on?
Yes, it should be.
Okay. So a couple of different things are taking place during injury. And some of the things that happen during injury are good and some are bad. So some are compensatory mechanisms and others are just the result of the pathology. And quite often it's not easy to tell which is which. So when we're studying, a lot of studying the nervous system has been, we've learned a lot by studying injury. And when you dissect apart what's happening in injury, sometimes we're surprised that things that we thought were bad were actually good. Some things we thought were good were bad. Quite often, when these circuits are damaged, and you think of, well, how are they going to try and repair themselves? They often revert back to what happened during development. So you'll often see proteins or connections that weren't normally found in the adult brain, but they would be more reminiscent of what might be found in the fetal brain or in an infant's brain. If you were to have the same type of activity, you could potentially reshape those in an activity-dependent manner in a good way. Alternatively, you could also have these connections that go a number of different ways, and they aren't really established in the functional manner in which they should be. The CNS is still trying to compensate, but it doesn't quite get us all the way there. And there can be complications, things like if you have too much excitatory activity, you could have a seizure as a result of not having a proper balance between inhibition or excitation. And that from sort of the very basic neurochemical perspective, what we're trying to do is look at those changes and discern which of them are potentially good, which are potentially deleterious, and then try and block the deleterious ones and enhance the good ones. I don't know if that helps, but...
That does help, and I thank you so much for this series. You've given me the greatest appreciation of what can be discovered quite even by accident with research.
Great. John?
I also would like to just say a couple words about the idle brain, and I think it's important for us to think about how do we define an idle brain. It turns out, of course, mindfulness meditation or meditation is something that enhances brain function in a variety of ways, and although the individual will look idle and you might think the brain is idle, it actually is working and developing. Maybe the best example of an idle brain is the brain that's watching television. And there has been some pretty significant and important research on the adverse effects of early television viewing among very young children, so much so that the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends no television viewing for the first 2 years, period. And that television viewing seems to adversely affect cognitive development in a number of different ways for young children. The other thing about the idle brain that I would say is that's important to remember is that human interaction is a very much a not idle thing for the brain to be doing. And some early research on children, and again, this was done by Dimitri Christophas at the University of Washington. And what he found was that, and I think this is really interesting, that he looked at exposure to the number of words that parents say to their children, very young children, and also exposure to words on television, and exposure to words in two-way conversations between parents and children. And he found that the number of words that the child was exposed to facilitated language acquisition and language development. And he found that that only counted if they were real human words, and television words did not count. And also, what he recommended at the end of the study was that parents engage in more two-way conversations with their children, which seems to be the most facilitating of language acquisition and development.
Sharon.
So how would that affect learning through a screen, through a computer or a program that you listen to, compared to learning in person?
I'd like to pass. I think that I'm aware that there are many advocates of online learning here, and that online learning, I think, is very important in our culture. And I do think that when online learning works the best, but I'm aware of an expert in the front row, that it usually involves some kind of interactive component that also includes some, at least, relevance or implications for human interaction. And I'm saying that in a very general and safe way.
Sharon.
I have a question about the adolescent brain and learning and the time of day that school starts. I'm curious about any research that you may be aware of, particularly in terms of timing the start of the high school day. I think a couple of years ago, I can't remember if it was Michigan or Minnesota, that pushed back the start of their high school day and saw some improvements in graduation rates and a drop in absenteeism. So.
Mark.
I'd be happy to jump in there. You're correct. There has been a significant volume of research regarding the start of high school days in particular. I don't know if it has anything to do with the adolescent brain and the pruning of the synapse or what the cause might be, but we do find our experience locally is that our attendance is dramatically worse first period. That's where kids get in academic difficulties because of missing first period. And we have actually considered that we may need to revise our school day. It's complicated for a number of reasons, but we've done some exploration with the other AA districts around the state of Montana. We'll conceive of possible flexibility in the school day. We might have, for example, an option for a 0 period for those students who do like to come early, who may have work obligations or other afternoon obligations. We may extend the workday into the afternoon. There's no magic that says you have to attend 7 consecutive periods that begin at 7:50 and end at 3 p.m. We might have a flexible day, and students might configure their own schedule with teachers teaching, say, 7 periods, starting as early as 7:30 and maybe going until 5 or 6 at night. We find with credit recovery, night high school options tend to be good options for teenagers because, again, their sleep cycles and probably their brain cycles are different than what many adults would expect.
I have a question. Is this on? Oh, yes, it is. Okay. I have a question about PTSD and how it may affect the brain, whether the PTSD is from a war experience, abuse, or neglect.
I think it's really clear that, again, what I think we should emphasize is the unique aspect of the brain. And I think it's really clear that PTSD has very significant effects on the brain, and in particular in the hippocampus. And so my guess, although I'm not aware of specific research to support or not support this, is that there are some differences in the ways that the memories are stored depending on the nature of the memories. And yet, in general, if the individual viewed the experience as traumatic, as there are a number of ways we define that, but as an individual feeling as if his or her life was in jeopardy and extremely threatened by a situation, could be a natural disaster, could be a rape or a mugging, could be a war incident, and that in all those cases, I think what we see are similar processes, and yet there are some unique ways in which those particular memories seem to affect the individual's functioning.
So they create different pathways for thoughts?
And I would say yes, that they're somewhat different and somewhat similar in that they're stored in a similar region in the brain, and yet they're, and I think that what Chris said earlier about the reconsolidation of memories is really probably the most important thing that's relevant to trauma and trauma treatment, which is why often we have to focus on the memory in order to change the memory or to modify it. And Chris, you mentioned that possibly with drugs, but I think it's also something we do in psychotherapy and counseling, to have the person remember the traumatic incident, and then in some ways we're trying to reconstruct it in one way or another through verbal and emotional methods.
And I would add that I think the research is very clear that trauma and stress affects learning. And I see Rick Van Poel sitting in the second row, and I know that he and Dick Manning are very involved in a project with our local schools looking at children who've had experience with trauma and actually trying to deal with that trauma so that they can effectively benefit from the educational process. You know, it's something that I think we're just learning about, but I also am just stunned by the figures they present regarding the number of students who have experienced childhood trauma and the dramatic effects that plays out then in our schools and in our classrooms. So I appreciate the work they're doing.
I'd like to make a comment on this too, but in a more general sense, that you know, one of the through lines on all these talks is the way in which lesion studies, trauma studies, studies that allow us to see functions being disabled, give us a kind of broader global picture of how the mind works in general. And Antonio Damasio's work has made really clear the importance of emotion in the construction of how the brain functions, but also consciousness, higher order work. And I just want to make a plug for some of the work that I referred to last week. Marie Carruthers wrote an incredible book called The Craft of Memory about medieval memory technique. And I'm sort of gesturing back to Chris, because Chris had sent me a great essay that I referred to last week, co-authored with a neuroscientist named Yadin Dudai. But all the way back in this early work, and we're talking about 4th, 5th century, these monastic memory techniques had already theorized the real central importance of emotion in the storing of memory. They called it intentio or affectus. And they really stressed to monks that when they were memorizing long passages, they needed to generate, if they did not have already, an emotional affect to help them store the idea. And so they would often suggest memory techniques that they would ask them to conjure up powerful memories, either hate, anger, love, something from their past, some personal memory, and then attach it to the memory as they were building their structures. So there are a lot of, I guess what I'm getting at is there's a lot of traditional, very old conventional methodologies in human culture that we're finding out have a kind of underpinning in our biology that we didn't really understand that well, and that we're kind of, I think it's leading us to a deeper appreciation some of the wonderful culture systems that we've evolved, quote unquote, naturally, right, out of our brain systems.
Yes.
You've been talking a lot about language learning. I was wondering if I might ask a question about second language learning or second language acquisition and pedagogy. Many of the speakers have discussed language learning in children and talked about learning. Rich talked about how cells learn and said that if we all stayed mentally active, we would help delay the onset of Alzheimer's, like, for example, attending these talks. But about the same time as Rich's talk, a study appeared, you're probably aware of it, from Canada, suggesting that second language learning, either early or as an adult, can also help delay the onset of Alzheimer's, since, and I have a quote here, the bilingual people exercise a brain network called the executive control system more. The executive control system involves part of the prefrontal cortex and other brain areas and is the basis of our ability to think in complex ways. I think this would be a very good recruitment tool for modern classical languages. I don't know if Linda is here or not. But anyway, my question would be, the usual paradigm about learning is that children can pick up a second language very easily, because their minds are so flexible. However, according to this paradigm, adult learners have much greater difficulty, since after puberty, the native language sort of becomes hardwired in one's brain, and thus presenting the learners with greater difficulty because of the interference of the first language. So I was wondering, number one, is this paradigm, given contemporary research about the brain, still a valid one? And secondly, can contemporary brain research offer any new insights into improving pedagogy for second language acquisition, both, say, for teenagers and adults? Thanks.
I might take a little bit of a shot at that. One thing I could point out is that there's really good evidence from the neurological literature that if you know multiple languages, there are many cases where a lesion has shown up and it will knock out one of those languages but not the other. And it's very clear from a series of studies like that that when you possess multiple languages, they're not all co-localized in the same part of the brain. And this is really important because there's a concept called brain space that it's a little bit loosely defined, but it sort of relates to that hippocampal work I showed you, that there's only so much space for the hippocampus, and if you expand one area, you might have to contract another. So the more space you can set up in the brain that can perform a given function, the more flexibility you're going to have. So clearly that makes sense from a basic neuroscience point of view, that if you have successfully engaged a second language, you've probably increased the total brain space that's involved in language processing, and that should give you more resistance to changes over time. Yeah.
One of the questions that was asked was, how do we train teachers and keep them current? So my question is partly in regard to that. It seems that there's some difficulty with bridging neuroscience into other fields because it may seem somewhat esoteric to folks who aren't trained in it. So aside from a lecture series such as this, how would one propose to do that, on the one hand? And number two, how do you think neuroscience can deal with implications of their findings? For instance, I'm thinking of psychopharmacology and how that may be simplified for the public in order to sell a product, et cetera.
I have one thought on that, and then I'm going to ask the folks on the table to jump in. I've thought a lot about that before tonight's lecture, and one of the things I was thinking about is, if you think about neuroscience as a pretty expanding, vigorous field right now, and education is a field that has a long history of trying to figure out what works, what's practical, how to apply it. And we give out EDDs to folks, and they become the future administrators of educational systems. And you would be better able to answer this than I, but I think that training tends to focus you on practice and then administration. And the question is, do we have a degree that focuses on pulling science into the practice so that when you get the degree, you don't become a principal or you don't become an administrator, you become a practitioner at a very high level. And what would that degree look like? Would it be a Doctor of Human Sciences? And would that be in your college, Bobby? And would they be trained both in research and in pedagogy? And maybe that's training a new generation of folks who have a very different hybrid blending of real science and real knowledge of pedagogy.
Well, I think that's a great question. Actually, the genesis of the EDD is that it did focus on program evaluation at one point in time, but since 1987, it too has required original research. And in many studies by Gary Peltier and the like, it's identical to the PhD. The question is, what is the focus, really? And so is it system-wide? There are a variety of doctorates in education, and one of them does focus on the leadership it takes to manage and run schools. In this era of accountability, you might imagine that those are directed toward the social science arguments about what constitutes effective testing, what constitutes appropriate curriculum to back that up. And in this wave of change, it's really very dynamic, looking at data across the country. Other doctorates in education do look at advanced educational psychology issues, and while they are not neuroscience in that they don't require laboratories per se, their laboratories are the human experiences. Many cross-pollinate with PhDs in psychology, and there are a lot of such programs that look at the implications of this work for learning. So we prepare teachers with undergraduate degrees, and they do have exposure to some of this at a very cursory level as juniors in an educational psychology class. And as you might imagine, they look at data and they see how this impacts different classroom practices. In this wave of change, I think there's a tremendous opportunity to look at things as you describe. In fact, I would have to say some of the activities we've engaged in this year in P20 initiatives imagine laboratories existing at Big Sky High School, potentially, where people from Community Medical Center will work closely on science and implications for medicine, inspiring students and mentorships and teachers alike. And all of that in partnership with the university and the College of Technology. So maybe Mark wants to talk a bit about Region 3 explicitly, because it does have implications for this kind of work.
You know, education was a lot simpler when we viewed students as empty vessels and we just needed to fill them up. I do think that you see a lot more reference to brain science in the popular literature, but usually it's used in a context of validating practice that's already existing in the classroom rather than really leading us down new pathways. You can go back as far as Madeline Hunter 30-some years ago talking about the art and the science of teaching. And I think what we find is that as you read about brain research, many of the things that she talked about just simply from a practice standpoint are things that are really being validated in the brain research. Bobby referenced one of the initiatives that we have currently going in Missoula County Public Schools. We are looking at really moving our instructional program into the 21st century. And as part of that, we're looking to establish some specific academies in our various schools. And right now we're working on a health science academy project that would be in Region 3, which is the C.S. Porter, Big Sky High School, and the feeder schools in that area of town. Trying to bridge across discipline and to bring in community resources so that we can provide a more authentic experience for our students. All ties into the college and career readiness push that we understand to be very important to us today. We recognize that we need to revise courses, we need to revise curricula, that we have a wealth of resources in the community that remain untapped. And we need to try to forge some coalitions to bring those resources to bear on the activities that we conduct in our schools. So we're in its infancy, but the university and a number of community partners have stepped forward. We're really working on some opportunities for concurrent enrollment to dual credit. Largely we've done that in math in the past. For example, at Sentinel High School this year, we have about 130 students, primarily pre-calculus, discrete math students who are getting university credit while they're also fulfilling high school requirements. We would like to see that branch out into some of the vocational areas, the sciences, the writing, so that students have a running start, really, as they head from our K-12 system on into higher education. I did put out on the table out there some little cards. This is the paid political advertising. It references the 21st Century Schools initiative that we're undertaking in Missoula County Public Schools, and those documents can all be accessed off our website. We are in the middle of a project that's been privately funded, working with consultants from the Public Consulting Group in New Hampshire to do a gap analysis, take a look at what the research says, what we believe is important for our school district, and what our current practices are, and then try to refine our instructional program to meet the needs of 21st century learners. We heard reference earlier to screen time, and we know that that's a huge factor for students. But one of the questions we have to ask is, are there uses of that technology that we can essentially put into practice so that we can capture the interest and further engage the students that we serve currently? Is it to their benefit? Is it to their detriment? There probably needs to be more research, but we need to try and certainly enhance the engagement of our students, practical real-world applications, and certainly bring in the community partners in order to help make that happen.
I have one quick comment about that. Related to what Chris said, education is really about brain development, and teacher training, I think, in general, will help facilitate learner outcomes. But teacher training takes money and it takes time. And so I would just like to say that it's probably related to the political brain, in which case, I guess what I'd like to say that if we are really interested in brain development, then we fund education. And if we're interested in economic development or environmental protection or better health outcomes, we fund education, because people who have more developed brains will handle all those issues, I think, in better ways.
So, I'd like to add one more thing, because that question prompted a lot of ideas. So, a couple different points. One of them is, you've seen a lot of data, particularly from Sarah's work, Chris's work, where they've showed different types of brain imaging, very, very complex experiments. Most of those and a lot of the discoveries in neuroscience were done at medical schools. Okay. However, that area, neuroscience, is expanding. But if you go to a medical school, you look in a neurology department, and I'd only been at medical schools before I came here. You don't have an English department. You don't have a foreign language department. You don't have schools of education. So I think with neuroscience developing on this campus, we really have some opportunities that other universities don't have to look at those types of interactions and build on them. And I think tonight and the series of lectures has been a good indication of the different sort of novel ways we can go. Of all the different sciences, I think neuroscience is the most dependent on multidisciplinary interactions, and I think now you can see why, because it affects so many, can be studied at so many different levels, but all those levels need to be integrated. I think having the dean of the largest college on campus being a neurobiologist isn't going to hurt either. So that, I mean, I think that's something we need to take advantage of. Similarly, having a university of this quality in a size of town this size also leads to a great laboratory to just experiment and look at different ways to build on the resources of the university to help at all levels of education. And the thing, if you talk to any scientist, and I think the same thing will apply in people in non-scientific disciplines at universities, is the concept of discovery and bringing in new knowledge, new ways about thinking about other ideas, new ways of looking at the brain, new ways of understanding things. And that process of discovery is what really turns students on. And I think when you looked at the data that Chris showed, where the learning curve improved on high school teachers that had gone back into the lab, I think all you did was reignite that discovery process, and they were able to pass that on to the students. And that's something we have to keep doing.
There's a question over here, and then Royce.
I wanted to say, can I say one thing?
Oh, sure.
Because training teachers takes time and money, and both are obviously in short supply, I would echo what Rich said, is that just getting teachers excited and students together excited about the possibilities of science and neuroscience can bring a lot in just a short time. And I went and gave a 20-minute talk to my son's Hellgate Elementary class, and then Paxson actually 2 Mondays ago, to an after-school program. And if I leave, I don't have to tell them the top 50 neuroscience terminology in 20 minutes, but if I leave and they think that insects are cool and that brains control behavior and that just fundamental things, then that can get them excited. They see it right in front of them. They can touch it. And teachers can, it's a feedback between teachers and students, and then they can get excited about the next unit that's coming up.
I wanted to ask a question. I really appreciate this series, and Chris, you brought up an interesting word called cognitive enhancers. And many years ago, I too was an empty vessel. And I think today, my perception is that these cognitive enhancers are not just the drink of coffee, but Red Bull and many of the fructose-enhanced things that we take. But it's not just the fluids in the food that we eat that are quite different than they were 40 years ago, but we have these audio and visual stimulations now that are right in front of our faces, 12 to 14 inches away, at the exclusion of everything else around us. And I'd like the panel to speak to how this intensive focus of chemicals, light, and motion so tip our brain beyond these subtle evolutionary changes that Chris was talking about before, make huge behavioral changes in us. But this is a new time. These are foods and influences that are around us every day that we become either used to or we try to escape to the mountains to get away from it. But there's got to be some information from all of you that can help direct what and how teaching will have to change, because I'm not indicting the school systems for the increasing incidence of dropouts in high schools and colleges. That could well be a healing brain trying to find another way. And I'm just put that out. Thanks.
I'd like to respond, but I need to check my Facebook account right now, so.
Well, it's funny because at 4 o'clock I was speaking with another faculty member who teaches the use and abuse drugs. And she said that she spoke for 3 lectures about how neurons are, how they are formed and how they work and action potentials like Rich talked about. And they were all glassy-eyed and texting. And then she showed one YouTube video, and they're at the end of the class, they go, "Oh, neurons are so cool. That's really happening in our brains." So it is, I mean, this is anecdotal evidence, but I'm sure there's many other studies that support that the way students are learning now is different. It's visual, auditory, much real, and I think we'll have to take that into consideration, the effectiveness of our lectures and approaches.
And I think that's the perfect point, Sarah, because honestly, if you consider the way students learn today and the quick compression of information and ready access, we have to have a healthy respect for the discipline of the mind through memory and learn from this research about that. But in point of fact, there are many things at their fingertip they don't need to memorize as quickly and as much anymore. I mean, how many of you were Googling something earlier today? The big question becomes how we make it interactive, and specifically what are the best tools developmentally for middle school students, as you can see, learn differently than secondary level students, and how to keep what Mark termed the engagement factor there. So I think part of the solution even to the dropout problem comes about with programs like the Montana Digital Academy, which provides an asynchronous learning environment and some great testing mechanisms. Nationwide, this country is struggling with what some experts call the algebra problem. How do we increase our math and science capacity and knowledge? And interestingly, some recent research from California system is coming out, directing things toward more digital objects that can engage students. So imagine, for example, a physics problem where one might hear, responding to various mechanisms of learning, hear the explanation of it. And now let's say we're calculating a vector. Now there's an animation of it concurrently feeding us from the computer, and then subsequently a very automated and sophisticated testing system that can see, do we already know this and should we skip to problem 13, or do we need more work on this particular equation? And I think as we drill down in America about good education, we'll see that, interestingly, part of the very thing that becomes an Achilles heel and makes us go to the woods is part of the solution, too.
And I would just add, I think that in this day and age, we need to take a look at some new and different literacies than we might have 40 years ago. We really need to talk about how students learn to collaborate, how they learn to communicate, to be critical thinkers and problem solvers, and to express their creativity. And I think that one of the things we need to consider is, rather than the traditional lecture format, students need to be engaged in project-based learning. They need authentic tasks. They have ready access to data and information. They're much more comfortable as digital natives than many of us are with our traditional methods. They need to know how to apply that knowledge. They need to know how to understand whether it's good information. They need to be discerning consumers. And I think the skills of the workplace will demand that they have the ability to work with a variety of information, to be able to synthesize that information, to be able to communicate it effectively, and to be able to pull from a variety of sources in order to solve problems. So as we look at restructuring education, I do think we need to look to more project-based education. Kids need a schema to develop so that the learning makes sense to them in their world. And teaching rote memory skills has certain place in their education, but it can't be the primary source of their educational experience.
First, thank you all for this wonderful series. This has been fantastic. I have a two-part question. What should we do differently in the freshman year of college, based on what you all have said? And what should we require our faculty to know about brain science or learning science?
Well, I would argue that brain science should be incorporated into the training of teachers in a way that maybe it hasn't before. And as often happens, there's a couple of universities that have tried that already. Harvard has a neuroeducation program. Johns Hopkins has one. And there aren't that many, but there's a few that have realized that there's some new possibilities created by having neuroscience deeply integrated into the curriculum. And I would suggest that this is, as Rich said, we're in a sort of unique position here. We have a university with lots of good resources. We're of the right scale, where people know each other and can interact. And we could create possibilities for a new level of interaction between folks in education and folks in pharmacy, folks in arts and sciences. And I think that's where we should go for sure.
I think it's always the problem usually is of scale, but I think particularly in, I guess I best speak to the sciences, to get students connected with a laboratory where that discovery process is going on, I think is key. It gives the student a home, for one thing. It gives them a peer group that's 1 or 2 years ahead of them, because there's usually senior students, graduate students, postdocs, and the faculty all in that laboratory and environment. It gives them, they feel much more comfortable approaching faculty. And then it also gets them into problem solving. I mean, it's exactly what was mentioned here. When I try and talk to legislators in Helena about the importance of research, not only from what we're discovering, but what it teaches our students. So they end up having to learn as a team. They have to deal with information technology. They have to deal with collaborative research. They're addressing a problem they don't know the answer to, which is also a very different thing that we all face whenever you go into the real world is you don't necessarily know what the answer is. And working in a laboratory, problem-based approaches give you that firsthand experience. And it's also very rewarding because, I mean, I can remember, you know, getting into a lab and discovering something, just a minute thing. But I was the first person to know it, you know, and that never leaves you. And that's what we have to instill in our students. And they have to be able to tell what they do. Right, exactly.
I might add a perspective that I think is important, is to have the engagement with science not be just done by scientists. I think it's really important that folks from the humanities who know how to tell stories and know how to analyze stories get involved in the whole process of thinking about issues. And I think the first year curriculum, to get back to that, I think if you want students to get engaged in the issues, I think we should have humanists and scientists co-teaching big courses about fundamental questions, which is sort of like what we've been thinking about, where the perspective of a humanistic approach and a scientific approach get melded. Ethics becomes an integrated natural piece of the whole process when you do that. And the humanists, philosophers, ask fantastic questions of scientists, and then it forces the scientists to think about things in whole new ways. And that's not you know, contrary to what you're saying, Rich. It's just another layer on there that I think is really important.
I've been thinking a lot about retention at the University of Montana, and my sense of the freshman experience is that there are many freshmen who know what they want and hit the ground running and can proceed very quickly. And as you may know, and as Bobby knows, we developed a course for freshmen and undeclared majors at the University of Montana, and what we have found is that there's another group of students here, and those students are much more lost and really not connected with academic pathways. And so in this class experience, what we have found is helpful is for those students to have small groups where they can talk about their experiences, a little bit of a kind of group counseling experience, and then also learn some basic skills about how to make decisions about what kind of academic path they might want to get connected to or engaged with. And so I think any way that we can do that, and I hear Rich talking about doing that through labs, but any way we can get those students to find mentors, connect with faculty, be in labs, connect with other students who are a little lost and not ready for the academic piece of the university. I think it really is a big interpersonal puzzle. And once we solve the interpersonal piece, then I think we'll get the students engaged in the academic piece.
I was also done some work on retention. I was on a committee one day, and someone, I can't remember who it was, I think it was Joel Henry from computer science, said something really interesting to me, that our system is inverted at a university system from what we know from experience, which is first-year students need a personal touch. They need close contact, and we tend to put them in very large lecture halls. And then when we get to the end of the process, when we're deeply invested in a field, we can sit in a big room and we can listen to a big lecture and get a ton out of it without that personal connection, because we've built a passion for the field and we're already invested, and that's why we're there. And so what do? We have very small classes at the senior level, and we work one-on-one. And I thought that was a very interesting, I mean, I'd never even thought of it that way. And so I think the idea of scaling down the size for the freshman experience, I think, is really important. And I mean, to go back to what every faculty member needs to know, I really wish I knew more brain science when I was building my habits of teaching early on. I think really grad school is the place to do it, but you know, faculty development really ought to include, to some extent, new faculty ought to be introduce some real basic ideas about brain science as they're coming in as teachers, especially if they don't have a lot of pedagogical practice. I come from a field where in grad school you get a whole lot of pedagogical training, but not every field does, and I think that that's a crucial window for faculty coming in to really think deeply and seriously about what their students need to bridge the gap between really technical knowledge and where they are developmentally. And Chris's slides pointed out that, you know, there is actually a window there in adolescence where myelination changes, and that window is now perceived to be a little bit wider than we had originally thought. We thought, you know, the brain was more or less formed in early adolescence, and now recent research is suggesting that window is kind of a little bit longer. It stretches into 19, 20 years old for a lot of individuals. And so it's a really crucial time, a lot of changes going on in their personal lives, or there's growth and kind of new sense of freedom. And we can, you know, play a really positive role shaping that, or, you know, we can put them in big lecture classes and they can get lost very quickly.
Far be it for a K-12 educator to tell the university what you should do. We've worked significantly the last 2 years on our dropout problem, which is not too far afield from your retention issues. And again, it comes down to the personal connection and whether staff has personal connection with those students. And we take a look at our kids that we consider to be at risk and ask the staff who has personal connections, et cetera. And again, it's very telling. I think what you're saying is very accurate. And again, I'm not on the university campus, but I do have a daughter that's a freshman at another university that's significantly larger. And her experience, they have freshman interest groups. So they sign up. They have small groups of about 20 to 25 students that have a class and a discussion session together. And in many cases, those students comprise a single dorm floor. So they have those connections as a residential freshman interest group too. A way to build relationships and hopefully establish the early connections so that they can have a successful tenure at the university.
Dr. Summers Flanagan, could you elaborate, please, on the idle brain as it pertains to either meditation or prayer? You had mentioned that before, and it's something I've been very curious about for quite a long time.
There's been a fair amount of research, not a lot, on the effect of meditation on brain structure. And it's been found that there's a small area called the insula, which seems to be, it seems to thicken in terms of, it appears to have more brain cells after long periods of meditation than before. That particular part of the brain seems to be associated with a number of different activities, including self-control, and including the perception of time and the ability to delay gratification. And it seems like, you know, it's sometimes hard to say because people who want to meditate or engage in contemplative prayer are probably people who are pretty high in self-control and things like that. But I do think that this is one of those things that if you brought this question in a class I was teaching, I would say, this is a really good research project for you to undertake. Yeah, and I think there's so much more that we could do in terms of research in that area, and so I think it's a great question. I wish I could go into greater depth, but that's about what I have right now. Over here.
Hi, I just want to echo everybody that's thanked you so far this evening. I'm 48 years old and I just got diagnosed with ADD, and so I'm very fascinated about what's going on inside of my head, and so that's why I've attended these lectures. So thank you very much for everything that I've learned. And my question is, do you know if there's any scientists that are working on, or if, you know, at some point in the future, the male brain will actually evolve to the point where we can actually read the woman's mind like they think we can? Thanks.
It would mean I'd have to ask directions, and I can't do that.
I was going to say Shakespeare took a crack at it, and you could have a look at him. I mean, I don't have anything coherent to say.
And Freud took a crack at it too. And what I would say, and it might be in contrast to what Freud said and did, and that is it might actually involve interpersonal communication with women, which is something that is, I think, really, really important.
I just wanted to comment kind of back to something that Ashby said earlier, and kind of summarize maybe in a different way of what I think I'm hearing you guys say, and that is along the lines of being emotionally prepared to learn. And I think where I see a corollary is from management training and some of the studies that have been done in management in terms of the engagement of workers is that one of the top 5 things that has to be there for them in the workplace is that when they go to work, there is someone in the workplace every day that they absolutely know cares about them. So there's that connection, and again, that word connectedness I think you guys kept coming up with. And what I see with students in particular is that every one of them, like you're saying, for freshman experiences, is really yearning for that connection, especially with faculty members and people they look up to as people that might have answers for them. And so, and I'm hearing attachment to my right here as young children. And so I guess one of the things that I've been concerned about as a staff member here at the university too is the large sizes of the classes and how we're going to address that in the future and how we're going to address getting emotionally prepared. Along those same lines, as adults, one of my concerns is that I heard recently, and I can't remember the fellow's name, but I believe he was a former faculty member at Furman University in South Carolina, has written a book related to the degree of loneliness in our current society, that despite the amount of social networking that we have available, which is beyond anything we've ever dreamed about before, that there are more people in our society that are profoundly lonely and looking for connection, real interpersonal, parent to child, person to person interaction. And if we don't get that as adults and we're lacking, how do we pass that on to those that we're trying to teach and actually stimulate them in an appropriate manner?
Good comments.
I think that's a fabulous point, and certainly part of the retention problem is a loneliness factor. That's probably a better word for part of it. I would be remiss not to mention, though, that the university is exploring many of these things, and Mark, you would be happy to hear those freshman interest groups and even big question curriculum opportunities that are interdisciplinary are under discussion by our own faculty senate on a regular basis now. In addition to that, something very interesting, and Mark, you raised it, the University of Montana has stepped into learning community living. And so we have found, for example, the Honors College brings together groups of students, all members of the Honors College, but certainly majoring in all of our fields. And beyond that, they're exploring more kind of large, big question issue and content-related learning communities. Other universities have had tremendous success with this. You mentioned some work at Harvard. That's where Dick Light has pioneered a lot of this work that universities like ours are exploring. So it is very helpful, and maybe that constant connection among groups of students similarly booked for 3 classes. We have also begun that this year as part of our work. So freshmen walk in the door pre-registered already for a core, and they take some of those classes with the same group of 25 students to mitigate the loneliness.
Rick Vandenpoel is sitting right next to you, and I know Mark mentioned him already, and the issue that comes to mind when you talk about emotional readiness and when Ashby mentions that is that, of course, the brain that's preoccupied with anxiety and trauma and a sense of unsafety is really hard-pressed to learn very much. If I were to have some control over the public schools, one of the things that I might consider doing would be sort of a preschool, not for little children, but a preschool day where students come and they each get a chance to spend 5 or 10 minutes one-on-one with their upcoming classroom teachers in order to get a sense of relationship and safety with them first before they're in a group class with them. I think that might help ease some of the anxiety. And another one of the things that many children who've been traumatized experience is a thing we call rejection sensitivity. And so they often very quickly tune into signals that teachers might give that are disapproving, and that further checks them out because then they devalue their own presence even more. And so I think there are a few things that we could explore to address that issue, and I think it has a lot to do with that the brain is preoccupied with other emotional issues and not ready to learn.
Do you want one quick comment? Yeah.
I thought you had. Yeah, just attentional resources suggest too that connection. I mean, I'm a little bit less anxious about technology and the role that it's playing, I think. And maybe there are generational things at work here, but I see a lot of students on campus. The issue for them is they want to stay connected to their close friends, the people that they know already, that they're bringing with them to the new experience. I'm bothered a little bit that part of them is not here and present, you know, whether it be in the classroom or on campus or whatever. But at the same time, there's something to work from there, that most of these technologies are about connecting people to one another. What I worry about is the superficiality of the connections, that is the speed and rapidity with which we're moving through connections in a modern society. And so I guess I think of a lot of my teaching as being intervening in the circuitry that leaves us at that kind of quick hitting, information driven as opposed to knowledge and wisdom driven. I find myself having to make that distinction a lot in class. You know, that yes, you can look a lot of stuff up on Google, but you can't look up how you feel about a poem. It's not out there, you know, it's somewhere else. So I find myself having to make that distinction a whole lot. And so I think the development of a connection that goes beyond the superficial that's the hard part, and that's repetition, that's sustained involvement, whether it be with a text or an idea or a lab or whatever it is. It's sticking with something a little bit more continuously.
I've been reminded that the time is just about up, so I would invite everybody to stay around for a while, keep asking questions. We're going to stay around and happy to talk to you all. Thank you so much for coming, and let's hope this discussion continues at the university and at MCPS over the next couple of months. Thanks.